Welcome, and thank you for joining us as we continue a series of conversations on the Higher Education Philanthropy Initiative. Established by the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy in 2022, the Higher Education Philanthropy Initiative explores the ways philanthropy can advance the public purposes of higher education by building connections among scholars, practitioners, and funders. I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and to begin by welcoming Susan King, who is currently serving as Senior Fellow at the school. As Senior Fellow, Susan is distilling some broadly applicable lessons from her leadership in philanthropy and is helping us develop this Higher Education Philanthropy series. And now I would like to introduce our very special guest today. Vilas Dhar is an entrepreneur, technologist, human rights advocate, and a leading global voice on equity in a tech-enabled world. As president and trustee of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, Vilas champions a new social compact for the digital age that prioritizes individuals and communities in the development of new products, inspires economic and social opportunity, and empowers the most vulnerable. As a prominent scholar and civil society advocate on artificial intelligence policy and human outcomes, Vilas lends his expertise to the global community. He has been appointed by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to the UN High-Level Advisory Board on Artificial Intelligence, and also serves as the US government nominated expert to the Global Partnership on AI, and many other globally prominent boards. His LinkedIn learning course, Ethics in the Age of Generative AI, has been translated into 6 languages and reached over 100,000 learners worldwide. Beyond matters of artificial intelligence policy, he is a leading voice in philanthropy and civil society. He is an advisor to MIT Solve and serves on the boards of directors of leading organizations and efforts that seek to ensure that technology serves the public good. He holds a JD from NYU Law School, a master's in public administration for Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and dual bachelors in biomedical engineering and computer science from the University of Illinois. His doctoral work at the University of Birmingham drives novel approaches to economic and policy infrastructure for a data-enabled society to support and empower vulnerable populations. Vilas, thank you so much for joining the Lilly Family School community. It is now my pleasure to turn the virtual podium to Susan to begin our conversation with our special guests. For those of you in the audience, please put your questions in the Q&A box and we will get to them in due course. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amir. And Vilas, it's a delight to have you with us. Well, you've experienced higher education with all those degrees, quite a resume. You're running a foundation, so you know philanthropy, but you bring a new perspective to this series because you really have insights into the future, I'm going to say, technology and AI in particular, with an emphasis on AI for good. So I want to explore a number of issues on AI with you, but I want to start really with the fact that the AI has penetrated the popular culture and it's captured our imagination. And in some of your interviews, you've talked about how it can fix climate change, big issues, climate change, medical systems, and higher education. And so I want to really explore just the basic foundation, your vision for higher education, because many people see this as a time of real challenge for higher education. There's political pressures, there's demographic change that's affecting enrollment, and there's the issue of trust. At this particular moment, do you think that higher education is having an existential crisis? Do you think it needs to redefine itself for this new era?
What a doozy of a question, Susan. Thank you so much. Let me start off by saying thank you to both of you for this incredibly warm welcome. I'm delighted to be with you. And I sometimes feel a little awkward when that bio gets read out. And so I'm going to give you the one-line version of it. As you both know, I grew up not very far away from where you're sitting today. So I often like the one-line version of it, which is a Midwestern boy who just believes a better world is possible. I feel like that was enough that you needed to know about me for the bio. Susan, you asked a great question. I kind of want to take it in its parts. The first is, I want to tell you, I very rarely actually believe that technology will fix things. But I want to give you a little bit of nuance around that. I spent my career kind of at the intersection of building great technologies and working with human institutions. And the answer is very clear to me. Nobody who stands forward and says technology is going to fix our challenges can be taken seriously. But an intersection where we couple technological innovation with a human commitment to building institutional approaches that center rights and principles and values that give us a sense of what the future looks like. When those tools from technology are in the right hands, we're able to do some pretty incredible things. In my role leading the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, this is kind of what we get to do, and it's what's become my life's work, is how do we ensure that what's happening in labs and research facilities around AI actually gets brought to communities and individuals at the front lines of vulnerability, that we build the tools, technologies, and approaches that actually transform their way of conceptualizing the world around them, of building robust solutions to the challenges they face. Excuse me. So I'll give you a few examples. You mentioned climate change and a few other things. Tools and practices that let communities understand how rising sea levels are eroding the mangroves in their communities that they rely on for natural barriers to rising seas, but also for rich ecosystems. Tools that let us at macro level create advocacy opportunities for our leading civil society organizations to ensure we're putting the right policies in place around supply chains, around resource extraction, around labor, to ensure that we're protecting our future climate. And I could give you 100 examples across 100 disciplines, but I'll come to the question you asked, higher education. You know, I've spent a lot of time in higher education as a consumer, as a faculty member, as somebody who believes deeply in the value of these institutions. And I think universities have always played this incredibly critical role in times of extreme disruption. They're places that foster the creation of new knowledge, of building frameworks that let us conceptualize approaches. They're places that actually serve as incredible connection points between those who hold economic or technological power and the rest of us, the people who, in some view, might be consumers of it, but in my view, should be architects of that future. Now, universities have in many ways followed a pretty fixed model for hundreds of years. I'm painting with quite a broad brush of what they're supposed to do, of how they're funded, of how the pedagogy in the classroom works. And we're facing a time when many of those underlying assumptions that have guided that institutional form are either being tested today or will be tested tomorrow because of AI. Is there an existential crisis? I don't think the crisis is one of how AI will affect universities, but rather of whether universities are able to conceptualize what their great form and function will be in an AI-enabled future. Whether they can make the changes that are attached to that vision quickly enough to not just remain relevant, but to actually become architects of that future. And whether throughout that process, we can continue to serve students, research interests, and society at large without that kind of breakage that comes from massive transformation. So a bit of a long answer to a doozy of a question, but I'm happy to kind of pull that apart with you a little bit.
And that's exactly what I want to do. But there is an optimism there about the university has a significant role as well as a rethink. So let's go on the discovery front to start, because if people think about the lab is where so many things are improved and discovered and new knowledge made, and they exist on the university campus. But AI hasn't really grown out of the university campus. So what's the role of discovery with AI for a university?
Yeah. And again, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be stubborn, but I'm not sure I agree with your contention that it didn't come out of the university, right? I mean, let's really take that and pull it apart. The academic and intellectual foundations of AI over the last 70 years have primarily come out of academia. And
Yeah.
even if you look at the research models that corporates used in order to bring research into their institutions, they still often work on a principal investigator model with the ideas of intellectual freedom and the capacity to explore. If the place where that innovation happens has changed, the underlying models that drive the engine of innovation hadn't really changed until maybe a few years ago, and we can talk about that in a second, right? But up until about 2017, academic papers really grounded the rise of AI.
Okay.
Now, what changed? Well, two things, right? One was the fact that many of these innovations required a set of resources that were so far out of the reach of individual universities that the capital markets stepped in. And we funded through venture capital and through government grants and through a variety of other mechanisms, the massive concentration of computing power and intellectual capacity to take ideas that had been created in the academia and turn them into commercially viable applications at massive scale. Insane amounts of compute, the associated data that was needed to train those models, the power and infrastructure that was needed to create them, aggregated in private sector hands. That's one phenomenon. We should observe it, we should analyze it, but we shouldn't assume that inertia is inevitability. That simply because for the last 10 years, the massive leaps forward in AI have been driven by private companies in some way minimizes the incredible effort that's gone into AI in academic institutions. That's one.
Okay. I stand corrected.
No,
and
no,
I
no. Please,
appreciate that.
I don't mean to correct you at all, but I'll give you my observation from
No, well, you
both
know
the
more
research I
than,
read.
but I feel it's been so dominated by the corporates and venture capitalists. But I'm going to pull some threads on that in a moment. I want you to focus on the classroom side of, because AI has a real role in the classroom. And the last time I was in the classroom as AI was emerging and people were excited and also so fearful. They didn't quite understand it. So I love your phrase, the architects of the future. How should professors and how should university leaders strategically be looking at AI as a classroom issue that can help students and advance professors' opportunities?
You know, when I teach classes, I often talk about the lab, and excuse the bad pun here, but the lab is really where we're creating intelligence, if you will. The
Yeah.
classroom is where we invest in creating wisdom. It's actually a different mechanism of approach, that the classroom really is a space where we bring together students and faculty members in a shared process of discovering how we make sense of what the lab is creating for us. The classroom, to me, becomes the most important place where we consider what AI means for the world. We ask fundamental questions, not just about its technical complexity and how we teach people to build or use or design AI, but maybe much more fascinating to me, we ask questions like, what will AI mean in terms of the basic assumptions that undergird our economic model? How do we think about AI in the context of philosophical inquiry? Where does it change our approach to the foundational sciences? And those answers aren't being created exclusively in the lab. They're being created in the classroom, where people are coming together to ask these foundational questions and develop new conceptual frameworks that then equip an entire generation of new researchers and corporate actors to go out and use this in the world. If that's the frame, then to me, the question becomes, what are we doing in the classroom that isn't about fighting against an obsolescence of a previous practice or resisting the change that AI will drive, but rather becoming leaders in the pedagogy of what's necessary in order to prepare a new generation of leaders in AI and society? How do we move away from a discussion about whether or not ChatGPT should be allowed in the classroom because it might foster cheating, and rather ask the question, as we envision what the world will look like in 10, 20, or 30 years, what do our students need to know about AI in order to advance their work in their discipline in a way that lets them change where the frontier is in that field?
And that's a big change in perspective. So there's a lot of work for leadership, I think, on the university front. And I want to ask a really, in a way, a silly but very simple question. This week, the NVIDIA CEO, Wang, said, right now, everyone go out and get your own AI tutor. Everyone. Should everyone, student and professor listening to you today, get an AI tutor? Experiment?
Are you saying, can they do it today? Is that the question?
Yeah, should they go out and get an AI tutor right now?
You know, I use AI every single day, as you might imagine, and I often use it in a way that I might call it a tutor. What does that mean?
Yeah.
For me, I don't use AI to teach me things. I don't ask an AI, hey, give me answers to my questions. We're all very familiar with the shortfalls of AI in providing truthful, fact-based information. That also seems like almost like a boring way to use AI. Instead, I often, and this is almost an odd thing to admit, I use AI as a sparring partner, where I say, you know what, here's what I have written, here's what I've thought, here's what my perspective is. Ask me questions that test that. Force me to acknowledge where the weaknesses are in my argument and help me think about how I might expand what I'm saying in a way that covers those issues. It becomes, for me, I'm a lawyer in one of my sort of many careers here. I think of it as having a senior partner from a law firm, from my law firm, saying, how do I make what I'm saying crisper, cleaner, and more intelligent? That's something that's accessible to all of us. It doesn't require us to go down a deep, winding path around pedagogy. It becomes actually a very personal experience to say, do we have individually the humility to recognize that what we might want to express in the world isn't its best possible version, and that we can use an AI system to help us be better at it? Now, I translate that personal experience back to the classroom. All of the ways that a tutor isn't necessarily there for information transfer, but maybe is there for intelligence cultivation. Something that helps me structure my processes, my frames of thought, my abilities to take my lived experience and my perception and translate it into my ontological view of the world. Now, right now, the amazing thing about the moment in time we live in is that for most people, it's quite accessible to download an app on their phone that provides that for them. And this is a vast departure from where the tradition of higher education has always been, right? It's generally been that universities serve a incredible connecting point in an information scarce environment, that they concentrate and bring together information resources and make it easy for a student to learn. AI has flipped that on its head. Information is everywhere. What hasn't changed is where we learn the practical skills of taking all of that information and turning it into what I often call wisdom, our ability to make decisions in the world based on what we know.
That's a really exciting way to think about it. And thanks for sharing that, because I think we don't often hear about the kind of wide strategic vision of how we can interact with smart people who are not giving up their agency either. But let's talk a little bit, you touched it before, of the university as centers of innovation. Innovation is one of the central cores of this initiative, higher education and philanthropy. But so much money is needed right now, data centers, so much energy, computer power. I noticed a trend in the discussions around AI, around the costs of data centers and the use of coal, the climate change kind of pressures. So universities don't have the kind of money the venture capitalists have, or Silicon Valley. So how do universities stay innovations and centers of AI opportunity?
I'll posit that we are, as a society, committing one of the cardinal behavioral biases, which is to look at the last 5 years and assume that it tells us the direction of the next 50. It's true that in the current model of AI, many of the leaders of the tech companies would come forward and say unironically, bigger is better. What we need is more computing, more data, more power, more people, and all we have to do is surge more, and our AI models will become better. Just last week, we saw some evidence that that might not be the case, right? With a new model that came out in the world that's gotten plenty of coverage that showed that we might be able to do the same things that our private sector tech companies here in the US have done for fractions of the cost and fractions of the compute capacity. Now, I don't want to focus too much on that one example, but I do want to use it as a proof point for a larger argument. If what we have done is over the last 5, and let's even say the last 25 years, given over control of our technological destiny, of where we focus our research efforts, to a very small set of private companies who are pursuing market profits and are saying, you know what, there's a pathway for us where we just surge more and more and more, the role of the university actually becomes much more important as the source of asking all of the other questions that don't fit within that market-based approach. I would love to know, how do we build AI models that don't require more data and more compute, but rather use new and innovative models to design the underlying infrastructure of AI? And when I pose that question, the natural answer to me, when I say, where are the really smart people who are motivated by the thirst for knowledge and are not driven exclusively by that which will get them market profits? Where are they assembled in spaces that allow for academic inquiry and curiosity, where there's a model of peer review that lets us grow and build on each other's developments? To me, the answer for that is quite simple. It's in universities. We see evidence of this. We see it in where we go to deploy AI models with now communities around the world, particularly in the global majority, where we say, you know what, we don't necessarily need to take an off-the-shelf product from one of the 7 to 10 AI companies and say to a village that's trying to identify where its local risks are. I'll give you one example, a village that's focused on mudslides, something that is an existential threat to that village. Well, it turns out that the products that are coming from the massive tech companies aren't necessarily so useful for this village in figuring out where the mudslides will be. But you know what they were able to do was to go to a local university and engage with faculty and graduate students to build a custom AI model, quite small, not using all of that massive amounts of inputs, that's tuned and tweaked for the particular problem they're trying to solve. And they were able to deploy it across their village using low-cost sensors and an AI model that was custom built that actually gives them 15 to 30 minutes warning anytime there's a mudslide risk. That's a perfect example of a story where academia steps in to do something that the private sector companies don't and will never do. Solve a human problem that doesn't have a profit motivation attached to it, that brings really innovative thinking, that goes back to the foundational science of AI, and says, how do we build something that works in the situation we're curious about? I could give you 100 more examples like that. So I might say to you, I don't even agree with the underlying question that the underlying statement that innovation has moved from the lab to the private sector. I think my contention would be, and we've done some economic work on this, if you look at research and development dollars and spending, it's incontrovertible that the private sector now spends much more on R&D than is accessible to universities. But often what you find is they're using that money primarily for development or commercialization purposes. That universities still have the capacity to compete on foundational research. We just need to come up with some new ways for them to do that without having to go buy 10,000 NVIDIA chips.
And to be very specific in that center of innovation, to know where its value is and how it can serve its community.
Exactly right.
I mean, and then find some, I guess, philanthropic support and grant making that would let them move into that field, which is what scientists on universities have always done, right?
Exactly right. And I think the role of leadership of faculty in that is so critical and worth naming explicitly. That too often what we've seen, and again, in all the institutions I've been a part of, one of the great risks from a department or college level is that those rising superstars who are working in fields like AI or machine vision or machine learning are often at risk of retention because they want to, because they are the recruiting targets for the private sector. So I think one of the questions, and I don't have an answer for this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, is what do we do to reframe the value proposition for top-level academic researchers to stay inside of universities? One answer to that is to figure out how to resource them in an equivalent way.
Okay.
But the other is, do we do as good of a job as we should on ensuring that we have a value proposition that recognizes the value of academic research, that makes sure that they understand the connection between the research they do and the ways that it impacts the world around them? Are we creating that space for practical application of knowledge, even as we ask them to do theoretical research and discovery?
And that, the way you just described it is why I think this is such a moment of challenge for higher ed and why it's such a moment of opportunity. Because if we redefine that and really excite people with the power of the university to bring groups of people together to answer these kind of questions, we're back in business with the trust maybe back up too. This question is really inspired by Amir, and it follows that whole area that you're talking about, that universities really want to serve the public good. Who are the allies at this moment of AI with universities to pursue AI as a public good?
Now, this is one of my favorite things to think about, Susan, and I know that we've talked about it a little bit. I think I actually spoke to a number of students just yesterday and gave a lecture at a large university. And I want to share with you a thought that's a little bit tangential, but I promise I'll bring it back to your question. I shared the privilege that I feel that when I graduated from college with my first set of technical degrees, it was possible for me to say, I am a computer scientist. And that was an identity, right? A computer engineer, a computer scientist, a data scientist. At the time, the skills that I had learned in my technical training program gave me a professional identity that was pretty bounded. I could do computer science, which meant I could build a number of things. I think what's changed, and this is kind of, I think, the critical point, is I don't think that young people today graduating from these training programs have the privilege or luxury to just be a computer scientist. That the skills they've learned are actually most useful and valuable when they're applied to a set of domains of problems and knowledge that's much more than learning how to code or learning how to build an app. That computer science needs to be a skill set that's tied to a cross-disciplinary approach to who we want to be as professionals. Universities, I think, have the amazing privilege of being the conveners of that kind of cross-sectoral conversation. That AI ethics, and you'll often hear me say, I don't think ethics is a technology function, it's a human function, means that if you are an engineer who knows how to build an AI system, you need to be as well versed in how you ask ethical questions and proceed in a process of philosophical discovery as knowing how you apply model weights and figure out how you tweak boundaries and guardrails. So I think universities have this opportunity now to convene a new coalition, to bring together scientists and ethicists, policymakers, and the communities that AI will shape, to have a conversation about what the future is of this field, and to identify a new set of research questions that are attached to it. And we're seeing early success on this. There are a number of centers at universities around the country that are actually taking this cross-disciplinary approach, using AI as the thing that starts the flywheel, but really figuring out how to build both a pedagogy, but also a public presence that is about AI as a tool for a variety of social and structural transformations that need to happen.
Fantastic. Now let's think of it rebuilding in a way the university almost from the ground up. So our model still is so agriculturally based. You know, it has the rhythms of the agriculture, and you know, we answer industrial needs. And I think if you ask most people, tell me about what is a university, they'll think of a 20-year-old kid on a campus in a classroom. I'm wondering if AI is going to push us to a 21st century kind of vision, a new vision that really looks at formal learning in terms of how, where, and when students are going to do it, and really force people to think about the university as a different structure. Do you believe that? I mean,
I believe it. I don't ever want to feel like we're being pushed into that. I want to have, with deep conviction, the hope that leaders like you and like others across the country are actually going to proactively design for it. But I like this question very much. Let's take it back down to the basics. What should a university be in a future that is, let's say, has all the cornucopia of potential benefits of AI along with its harms and challenges? I see kind of three big roles, and this is where I sort of focus my architectural design, right? The first is absolutely an engine for discovery. And we've talked a little bit about this already, that we should never forgo that core capacity of universities to be, at their heart, research institutions that advance human knowledge at scale. But the models that we've done that in the past, slow, peer-reviewed science that requires so much time for anything to get from the lab to the public, that's already changing, right? From rapid reprints and work that we did in the COVID pandemic to say, how do we get knowledge out of the lab quickly, to using AI for foundational science. We've just seen 2 Nobel Prizes awarded at this intersection. And how do we ensure that universities are capable not just of using AI to advance scientific discovery, but again, are tailoring the AI systems we build in order to do that? Okay, so engine for discovery. The second is, if we believe in a world where AI enables lifelong learning, then why would we remain stuck in the conceit that 4 years of your experience at university is all you need for it? I would think of how a university becomes a hub for lifelong learning, of how do we expand out the pedagogical approach to really allow for people to connect back to the university in really meaningful and significant ways to build lifelong skills development, but also a place for them to take their curiosity and bring it at any point in their life. And I think that will require a fundamental reconstruction of the classroom, of what it means to be a part of the university, of what it means to get a degree or a certification, how we expand that out. And then I think the third piece of this, which will take us into, I know, a little bit more of an ambiguous space, is I still think of universities as a core part of our democratic institutions and spaces, that they are the places where people can come together and have robust debates that aren't merely around ideology, but are around ideas that actually allow us to build the frameworks for how we think about the world we want to create. And if universities no longer serve as that, then I don't know what steps into that vacuum. And so it strikes me that that's actually what we should design for, is continuing to build these institutions of connectivity, of liberal democratic values as a part of the institution.
There's some work that's needed on that because the trust in universities has eroded over the last few years. A question about philanthropy, since this is really an initiative that's really looking at the relationship between higher ed and philanthropy. I'm so interested in the McGovern Foundation. It's got a unique space in that you're the only, or since the beginning, you've made AI and its role in our society is key to what the McGovern Foundation would do. It's science-based, so understandable. But it's so interesting that I think you may be the only one in this space. So you're trying to really shape kind of questions, etc. Give us the origin story of McGovern and your vision for how philanthropy can really shape an idea.
Sure. Well, Susan, I'm really bad at keeping secrets, and so I'll share a little secret with you. We had, and I'll share the origin story with you. We had this moment now about 9 years ago, where we had this incredible gift from Patrick J. McGovern. He was a publisher in the late 20th century. He built an incredible company that translated what was happening in computing and made it accessible to all of us with magazines like Computer World and PC World and Mac World. incredible guy. But when he passed, he left this incredible gift and said, use this money to do something great for humanity. And with that, the secret is this. I'll tell you that I've spent 2.5 decades working around AI. I've built multiple companies, technology and all of that. And yet to me, AI is neither the outcome nor even the primary part of what we do. Instead, I think of it as a Trojan horse. AI is the set of 2 letters, the concepts that let us engage in really foundational questions about economic opportunity, about political participation, about human dignity. And we use AI as a way to get people to envision what possible futures look like, not merely based on how we iterate what we have today, but if we had this new set of technologies that totally transformed what we were capable of, what values and norms and principles would we bring to designing that future? So if it is the case that we are there are a number of philanthropies who we think are great partners and are really thinking about these issues with us, but if we've been at the forefront of that movement, it's not so much because we think of AI as the outcome, but because it lets us really foundationally address these questions of how we build a better society at scale. I think one part of that, and we've kind of touched on a little bit, is thinking about the institutions that we have today and whether they're fit for purpose, whether we need to innovate and design new models for how we think about technical innovation, but also how that's translated to all of these other domains of human expertise. We have to ask questions about who owns the means of production of AI, about whether you and I, our society at large, are okay with the world in which we've essentially given over control about technological decisions to the market rather than holding them for public purpose. And we think about how we take an incredible infrastructure of people who care so deeply, who work with communities in those most vulnerable places, who understand their problems, and whether we're willing to make the commitment to equip them with the tools that let them build solutions. And this, again, is where philanthropy and universities align quite well. Because if we're not going to make that commitment, then we've essentially just created a wedge in the road that says that those who are looking for profit will always be ahead of the game, and those who are trying to protect our most vulnerable will be behind. That's not a world that I really want to live in.
And philanthropy is such an interesting institutions themselves because they have their own agency. They're able to create their own view of where it is. Some people see it as an independent sector, but a real sector, but can have such influence. I mean, they've built the institutions in the United States. Universities were so dependent on some of the early values and more, as you know, that came out of Carnegie Corporation, where I worked. So your whole idea behind the McGovern Foundation is AI for good. But there is so much fear at this moment because so much money is needed to advance AI that the profit motive will really trump, to use a bad word at this moment, but will, overshadow those who are trying to bring in the kind of philosophical and ethical points of view like you have. How do we counter that? How do you put some guardrails up to make sure that it's not just the richest person decides what will be AI?
Well, I think my answer to you, Susan, is like the most human of answers, which is when storm clouds are gathering and blotting out the sun, what do? We build light bulbs, right? In a world where we say there are all kinds of things happening that are maybe creating more distance for us from the dignified and ethical future we want to live in, our concern is not merely to observe it and comment on it, but to do something that changes the game. For us, in the space of AI, that's been how do we think about broad-based capacity building, particularly across the global majority. It's how do we support policy making that's more than just regulating tech companies, but it's about thinking about public investment and positive public purpose in the ways that we create AI. It's about thinking about how we continue to shift the resources that are available in our society to support public purpose institutions at scale. And I have to tell you, I'm always optimistic. And maybe it's a part of where I grew up and how I think about the world. But it's important and nuanced to define that statement. And I said this right at the top of our conversation. I'm not optimistic about technology by itself. That to me seems like a fool's errand. I'm deeply optimistic about the fact that if we were able to make some good choices about how we take the technology we're creating and apply it to the possibilities and opportunities for the world we want to create, then I have great trust in our ability to make those decisions together.
And I'm excited to hear the students' questions. And this will be my last before I turn it over to Amir and the students' questions. some of the fears that faculty have, can we trust it, etc. But they really question whether AI can diminish or exacerbate inequities in education. So give us your perspective before we see what the students want to ask you.
Oh, I can't wait. I'm super excited to chat with students. But I will tell you, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this question in my career. And I've come to a conclusion that's actually pretty common sense. AI doesn't create new challenges. It amplifies and exacerbates the inequities in the system that we've built because we apply AI often to say, here is what we have done in the past, do more of the same. I think if we choose to do that, then we've really lost the game already. So we've seen it across a number of domains, and I won't go too deep into the details, but I'll give you one very quick example. We saw it in hiring when AI was used in an algorithmic way to screen resumes. And I want to just quickly tell you that story. We, as a society, quickly realized this was a bad thing, that AI being used in hiring was finding prejudice and bias and what kinds of candidates it selected, was often prioritizing on the basis of gender or on the basis of other things. We were very angry. And as a society, we said AI is biased, and we have a real problem with that. But for those of us who had worked in AI for a long time and who really took this and pulled it apart, what we realized was the biases that were showing up in the AI system was trained by the biases of the human individuals who had been making decisions for decades, who had built the data set that trained the AI. AI wasn't biased because AI is inherently problematic. It was biased because it was propagating the human biases that exist in the system. So what if we flip the script? Instead of worrying about whether AI would create inequity or bias, what if we used AI as a tool to examine the decisions that we make as humanity, to ask the question, have we been fair? Have we promoted dignity? Have we acted ethically? And be willing to engage with the fact that the tool might show us some things that might not feel so comfortable, but give us an opportunity to do better in the future.
Okay, so I always love when they flip the switch. So I'm going to turn it over to Amir and see how our students are coming along with just one little quote. I'm so glad to know the McGovern money has come from journalism that made a difference, since I am biased in favor of journalism. Amir, take it over.
Thank you both. This is such a fascinating conversation. I could listen to both of you keep going and going. And I want to encourage our students. I see questions starting to come in. And I'll just take the moment for them to consider their questions to ask you a question, Vilas, about this wonderful vision, knowing that technology doesn't emerge naturally from nature, but is kind of a product of our social processes. And being that you're a technologist and I'm a layperson in terms of technology, my sense was that there was a time, maybe idealized, where everybody who was exposed to technology could eventually look under the hood and play with it. And I'm thinking in the digital space, it's a little bit like Wikipedia. That's something that's open to everybody. And that was more of a vision of where the internet was going at one point. And now it's kind of a lone warrior out there as a volunteer-based global network. But it seems with AI, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that unless you are not unless you're at one of the, the tech titans or one of the very few universities that are leading in this space, there's not much of a chance for you to get under the hood of AI, and you're kind of mostly destined to become a consumer of it. And there's no tinkering, no creative. It's harder to become kind of that creative participant in the AI culture. Am I wrong?
You're not wrong at all. And I think you point to something that I think creates a lot of discomfort for me and many others, right? Which is, it's not just about AI, it's actually about the broader world we live in. The complexity of the world that we have created is that it's no longer possible for any one person to say, I understand, as the ancients would have said, you should be able to understand physics and understand philosophy and understand mathematics and understand ethics, and you should be able to be a master of all of those disciplines. I think that world is no longer within reach. So on one side, there is that challenge of really, I think there's nobody on the planet today that really understands at a deep and unit level how AI systems work. We have some hypotheses, but they're receding more and more from the public conversation. Well, what do we do with that? I think on one side, we have to acknowledge the cognitive dissonance it creates for us when we have assumed for so long that we are the most intelligent species on the planet and we are in total control, to recognize that these tools create for us a world where we might not have that same level of agency and control. It forces us to ask questions about guardrails, about what kind of boundaries we should put into these tool sets to ensure that they won't move beyond where we find comfort in what they do. And for us to have a real conversation about that, that's not just engineers saying, these are the safety implications we found, but allow us to come together to say, these are the historical, anthropological, sociological inputs that guide what these rules should be. And the last thing I'll say is, let's also look for that little bit of hope and excitement. I want to live in a world where I can be more than, where I can leverage AI systems and tools to make me more creative and more inspired. And if the trade-off for that is I don't necessarily know exactly how they work, then I think we need to engage in a conversation about just where our comfort level is with that.
And so just a small corollary to that, ultimately, AI, the way I simply understand it, would not have been possible without the repository of human knowledge, on which it is trained. And is there a point at which it starts generating its own kind of machine or knowledge that we should worry about, or we should celebrate and try to embrace in a more equitable way? Because at the end of the day, it seems like it is at some point a connecting of the human treasury of knowledge that we haven't been able to connect ourselves, or at the speed, at the scale. So in some ways, you can see it as a celebration of human ingenuity, but then at what point does it go beyond? How should we think about that?
There's two questions there that are so closely intertwined that they often create unnecessary complexity. So let's pull them apart. On one side is, what do AI systems do in the advancement of knowledge? And again, I mentioned kind of DeepMind's work and some of the other work that's happened around the use of AI in foundational science, where it is accelerating our ability to discover in super meaningful ways. And some of that is something that only AI systems can do. Human researchers couldn't together come and design the protein folding of hundreds of millions of molecules in the way that AlphaFold was able to do. But the second part of it that you asked, I think it was a critical question, was, should we worry about it? And that, I think, is the question that we should really engage with. On one side, we have a lot of folks who are trying to scare us. For everybody who's an expert in the field, I think one of the big things that are missing is we don't often recognize that capacity doesn't mean agency. We often worry, and Hollywood continues to reinforce the fears for us that robots will take over or AI will become self-aware. As far as I know, and I follow this literature quite closely, there is zero evidence that that is anywhere in our kind of development path that AI will become self-aware. AI will continue to do what we tell it to do, what we ask it to do. Maybe we should spend a little bit of time making sure that we're quite certain that the things we're asking it to do are actually what we need it to do and what we want it to do, and we're not creating unnecessary risks.
Yeah, I think that sounds a lot more a reason rather than kind of apocalyptic warnings, which you wonder what motivations people may have.
Maybe I should fix that by making a statement about how I also will bow down to a robot overlords. Like we need to find some balance here, right?
You have to hedge your bets, right?
Exactly.
Just in case. So before we open it up to some of the questions that are coming up, let me ask you about something that I think all three of us share as a deep value, and that is the independence of our universities and the role that our faculty have in terms of being able to follow their curiosity and to freely share the fruits of their thinking and their collective communal pursuit of knowledge. How do you think about the political economy of maintaining that independence, given that, from the one hand, we have a really powerful private sector that is obviously so more prominent in some ways than the old industrial sector in terms of its impact on universities. And then on the other hand, you have a state that is not only in the United States, but elsewhere, more skeptical of the independence of universities and kind of interested in certainties and not kind of open-ended questions. Kind of the independence of our universities, and philanthropy is one potential answer, but philanthropy too, its position is very contingent in our society and can be challenged quite quickly. So give us some sense of how we should be thinking about the grounds of our independence and how to build it and make sure it stays independent.
These are great questions. We have really traversed a broad space here, and I really appreciate this conversation. So what I will say is this. You can pick your starting point, but I often think of 1400 as a starting point. Since the birth of the modern university, universities have consistently been tested on questions of independence, because so often they have been the laboratories of progress, and progress has often been at odds with institutionalized power and hegemonic and oligarchical systems. Universities have always endured because at the end of the day, there's two things that have to happen in concert. One is a reaction to the moment, recognizing how power is changing and how to ensure that the value and virtue of what the university provides stays constant. And the second is the innovation function that has forced universities to reconceptualize what they are at multiple periods over the last 600 years, where they've gone from purely teaching institutions to purely research institutions to having significant political participation or engagement with faith-based institutions to stepping away from all of that. That they have had to figure out how to float on the currents of the time and hold the integrity of that unique position that they hold in civil society. That's the longitudinal response. The short-term response is this, and again, I'll be somewhat flip with you. As somebody who leads a leading philanthropy, I have learned and know deeply that philanthropy is never the answer. And it shouldn't be. That's not the point of philanthropy, is to say philanthropy will step in to sustain funding gaps over the long term or will help to reconceptualize kind of how these institutions exist using money. Philanthropies should not really be about the economic resources they hold, but rather about their ability to deploy those to do that frontline, high-risk, catalytic innovation that leads to new steady states. So in this moment in time when higher education feels, we use the term existential threat at one point in the conversation, I'm not sure I'd go that far, but feel under attack, I think a few things I would think about. One is, how do we respond to the moment? I've met with a number of university presidents recently. Many of them have shared with me the intense conversations they're having internally about how they even take a position on political engagement or on kind of integrity of academic research. Universities have to figure that out, and they have to do it in public, transparent, and trustworthy ways to ensure that we don't continue to erode the public social contract between academia and society. But, and this is super critical, even as they're figuring out how to react to the moment, they can't lose sight of the fact that they have a role to play over a 10, 20, 30, 50-year, 100-year time cycle.
Mm.
And that means that being myopically focused on dealing with the risks of today without planning for that long-term sustainability puts the entire institution at risk.
What do you see any examples of innovations, moves, leaders who are kind of green shoots for what is to emerge as the next generation of an innovation institutionally?
Yeah, I think and I'll start with a technology-based answer and I'll maybe expand it out a little bit. But I think one of the most exciting things that's happened, and really has been many years in the making, but we're seeing it more and more today, is building new institutional forums inside of and next to universities that allow for good connection to the private sector on research and development. So that's often funded and collaborative research. It's building new relationships between the researchers inside of companies and the academia and allowing them to collaborate more effectively. It's also recognizing that universities have often too formal, too structured, too burdensome pathways to commercialization. That for a researcher to take something they've created in the lab and bring it out to the world creates so much friction and headache. They often find it's easier to simply go to the private sector to innovate. We need to change that in higher education. I think a number of universities are trying to think of incubation and accelerator labs, of new forums that let them do that effectively. That's the technology answer. I think more kind of writ large, I think where universities are engaging in, let's say, better constituent management engagement with communities, where we're opening the doors of the university and saying, rather than a university inside of a town, a university is part of a community, is part of a state, is part of the country, and allowing for these kinds of discussions that we've talked about, bringing together and convening political discourse, even at a time when political discourse feels so loaded and scary, of supporting journalism in all of its forms to say that academia and the fourth estate aren't necessarily separate and distinct parts of civil society, but need to collaborate more effectively. And we're seeing some great experiments in that space as well. We're seeing academic labs build products that are then used by newsrooms and more things like that as well.
Wonderful. So I'm glad that IU is doing some of those things, and
Yeah.
IU Lab and our community engagement. So that's very positive. Let's turn to, I have one more question for you, but if I have time at the end, I will ask you that. Let's turn to some of the specific questions we're getting from our audience. One is, how do we answer the question of offsetting the environmental costs that the environmental cost that AI causes?
It's a great question. Offsetting is a super interesting part of that question, but a few things. One, we recognize that the private sector is going to just continue on this path of more energy, more power, more environmental kind of impact. I think we need to focus on the power and potential of lower cost, smaller AI models. Again, I mentioned that there's been some proof points on that just in the last few weeks, but through our research and the work that we do with our partners, we're seeing so many places where much lower energy consumption can actually lead to the same possible outputs and value. So that might change just the broad inertia of where we're going with AI and energy consumption. The second is we should invest in all of the places where AI can actually help not just offset, but actually create climate value. Some really basic things that we've been spending time on are things like how do we build AI systems that allow us to more efficiently manage the energy grid, that let us better place renewable energy resources so that we reduce our reliance on coal and gas-fired power plants, that let us better understand the flow dynamics and where we place hydroelectric power. So AI can actually really increase efficiency in how we're thinking about energy production in ways that reduce its climate impacts. And earlier in our call, I spoke a little bit, and we have an entire body of work on where we're using AI to do not just climate mitigation, but adaptation and resilience at scale. And so offset's an interesting term. I don't feel like we should have to offset the stuff that the private sector is doing. We should be able to use AI to realize a new climate future because of its incredible opportunities. Along the way, I think we might also have to offset some of what's happening with that private sector consumption.
Another attendee asks, if I can't change an entire university system, what steps can I take to increase AI fluency within my classroom or program?
I love this question because at the end of the day, for me, the answer to all of these questions, as highbrow as we've been, is about individual agency. I get asked this question a lot from teachers, from superintendents, from tutors in the classroom and outside. And the pathway, I think, is, again, quite common sense. The first is to recognize that in order for us to teach effectively or transform our classroom, we need to become masters of the domain, which means that we need to build a way to teach trainers how to have really high-level AI proficiency. This doesn't mean learning to use the tools, right? That will happen. It'll happen naturally. Now everybody knows how to use the commercially available GPT apps. But I'm really focused on this question of how do we make sure that those teachers who are at the front lines in classrooms recognize the potential uses of AI as a pedagogical instrument. This thing that we talked about earlier, don't just use AI to draft a response to a test question. Use it to ask you questions to find the weaknesses in your argument. Ask it to help you make your writing better. And that's just a set of first order responses. I think there's so much to be innovated and developed. So to the individuals, I would say, one, understand and become fluent in what the capacity of AI is. Innovate new approaches in your classroom, and then commit to sharing them in communities of practice, which are convened by universities, by philanthropies, by, I think now, by superintendents and others who are trying to step into this, and make sure that we're actually moving that knowledge laterally in a way that actually changes the experience of education.
As you were speaking in terms of more tactical, on-the-ground individual agency, is there a consumer reports-like facility for me to understand all of the weekly new products that are coming out?
It's a great question. And unfortunately, the answer is not yet, but we're working on it. And again, this just goes back to something that Susan mentioned, the absolute necessity of a journalistic sector that's able to report and translate and share what's happening and make it available to all of us. And so we work with nonprofit newsrooms across the country to increase the capacity to tell these stories. I wish I could tell you there's one place I would send you today, but instead I think, our news is getting better and kind of helping us connect to this stuff. And I encourage everybody here to follow us on LinkedIn, and of course you all as well. We share a lot of information about what's happening with AI out to the world over social media. And so welcome people to follow and engage there as well.
Great. Well, that's very helpful. Let me turn it to Susan to share her final reflections before we turn it to you, Vilas, to give us your concluding thoughts.
Well, I guess for me, there are two things. I am very optimistic about AI as well, although I'm not so technically terrific, I have to say. But I love your story about the mudslides and how the university helped through AI to really identify them, because I think community and the university are always two things that are really critically important. And so building that community. I want to ask you one last question. This election showed sort of the political election in 24. Many people saw that it was a divide or a gap between those who have high school educations and those who have university educations. AI is a threat to some people, or beyond their experience in that. And that divide sort of worries me. As a journalist, I've always looked at elections as telling us stories about our time. Do you see this as a divide, a moment where you, as a person looking at AI for good and as a foundation, can really bring along the community, the larger communities, into realizing the power and the opportunity and the potential for AI rather than fearing this kind of change, which many people saw as the divide?
There's a lot to that question, Susan, and so I will share with you this. One is we are living in a world, even in the past few weeks, that's demonstrating to us that many of the convictions we held about how we believe in equity, in the pursuit of justice, in the importance of diversity, are being tested, not on the quality of their ideas, but in how they are implemented in our governmental functions and our societal functions. I don't think the divide is about level of education. I don't think the divide is about fear. I think the divide that we have experienced today is about a foundational question about what our vision is for our society. And I don't think that people are choosing between two visions. I think, unfortunately, they've lost trust that those who are in power are creating a vision that works for all of us. So I'm not naive and doe-eyed in any means, and I don't believe in optimism as a replacement for realism. So let's be both real and hopeful that if AI is able to deliver many of the benefits that we think it will, economic productivity, the ability for people to have more leisure time and everything else, that needs to be accompanied by a new vision for what our country will be, for what the world will be, for what our society is built on. And that vision has nothing to do with technology. The question that faces us as a society is, are we going to come together to make moral choices that center individuals and communities in vulnerable places, that commit to supporting those who have to flee where they live because of conflict or terror, that make sure that we express our basic human principles around generosity and kindness? To me, the election does many things, but maybe what it centers more than anything else is the need for us to have a new social reckoning and for us to come together and say, who do we aspire to be? How will our institutions support us to become that? And who will lead us into that era?
Thanks, Vilas. I think you've brought great perspective to this whole initiative and the conversation that Amir and the school is trying to have. And you leave us with that, a really wonderful, I'm not going to use the word optimistic, but hopeful conversation in this country, because I think America's has been an experiment that has always taken on the challenges of its time. And I hope we're up for the next one. So technologically, ethically, and personally, because it's all about community. So Amir, thank you for letting us have this hour.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Vilas. This was wonderful. And I leave inspired with the sense of ethical curiosity about what is possible. I want to thank all of our audience for joining us. Please join me in a virtual thank you to Vilas and Susan for this wonderful conversation. And please join us next time on February 24th in our related series on philanthropy and public policy, when we will welcome Romanita Hairston from the Murdoch Trust to speak about the intersection of policy and philanthropy, which is another important foundational conversation. Thank you all. Be safe, and we appreciate your attendance. Take care.